It was a crisp morning when Staff Sergeant Jasmine Daniels walked through the doors of the bustling airport, ready to take her well-deserved break after months of deployment overseas. She had been working hard, and now she was about to fly home to see her family. It felt like a victory, a moment she had been looking forward to for so long. But little did she know, the day would soon take an unexpected turn. As she approached the check-in counter, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. She was finally going to relax, enjoy her time off, and be with the people who mattered most to her. She had made her reservation months ago, securing a first-class seat for her journey. As a military member, Jasmine was used to sacrifices and hard work, so the comfort of a first-class seat was a small reward for her dedication. "Good morning." Jasmine greeted the attendant with a smile as she handed over her ID and ticket. "Good morning, ma'am," the attendant replied, glancing at her ticket before typing away on the computer. Jasmine could tell that the attendant was focused, but something seemed off. She noticed the woman's brow furrowing slightly as she continued to type. Jasmine's excitement started to fade a little as she wondered what was going on. After a moment, the attendant looked up with a tense expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's been an issue with your seat. It appears your first-class reservation has been reassigned." Jasmine's heart sank. "What do you mean reassigned?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a sense of confusion and frustration was already creeping in. "I'm afraid that another passenger has been given your seat," the attendant explained, her voice not quite apologetic. "We don't have any other first-class seats available at the moment. I'll have to put you in economy class." Jasmine felt the words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had planned everything carefully, expecting to travel in comfort after such a long and exhausting period of service. But now, everything was falling apart. "That's impossible," she said firmly, trying to hold her ground. "I made my reservation well in advance, and I was confirmed for that seat." It was confirmed. The attendant offered no explanation for the mix-up. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. It's a system error." Jasmine tried to remain calm, but inside, a fire was building. She had worked tirelessly, often risking her life for her country, and now she was being treated like this. She had earned that seat, and the idea that someone else would get it was maddening. With a deep breath, she nodded. "I'll just take whatever seat you give me," she said, keeping her voice controlled, but inside, she was seething. As the attendant handed her a new boarding pass, Jasmine felt a pang of bitterness. She had tried to remain gracious, but her pride and dignity were being tested. Her uniform, the same one that had earned her so many commendations, now felt like a reminder of how easily she could be dismissed, just another passenger in a crowd. She turned away from the counter, clutching the new boarding pass. The mood of the day had shifted completely. The excitement that had filled her earlier had been replaced by a quiet anger that she could not shake. Little did the airline know, they had just made a huge mistake. This was far from over. As she walked toward security, Jasmine's mind raced. She could feel the eyes of others on her, some curious, others indifferent. But what they didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Jasmine wasn't going to let this go. Not today. Not after everything she had been through. As Jasmine walked toward the security line, the sting of disappointment hung in the air. The first-class seat she had worked so hard to earn, the comfort she had looked forward to for so long, was now out of reach. Instead, she was stuck with a lower-class seat, feeling like she was just another face in the crowd. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. This wasn't just a mistake, it felt like an insult. She pushed through the line, her thoughts racing. She had served her country for years, fighting in difficult and dangerous situations. She had earned her rank, her respect, and her right to a bit of comfort on this flight. But it seemed that none of that mattered now. She was just a soldier, overlooked and dismissed. As she moved toward the gate, the frustration inside her built up, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being treated unfairly. Once at the gate, Jasmine found a seat and sat down, trying to calm herself. She opened her phone and started scrolling through her social media feed, trying to distract herself. But even as she looked at posts from friends and family, her mind kept going back to the incident. She couldn't help but think about how this was just another example of how black women, especially black military women, were often overlooked and disrespected. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the principle. She knew she had done everything right, and yet she was being treated as though her service didn't matter. A voice broke her from her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice said, and Jasmine looked up to see a fellow passenger standing next to her. It was a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with the airline staff," the woman said. "I'm so sorry about what happened. I just wanted to say that I think it's awful how they treated you." Jasmine was taken aback for a moment, then managed a small smile. "Thank you. I'm just frustrated. I was looking forward to some rest, but now." She trailed off, her voice dropping as she stared at the ground. The woman sat down next to her, nodding. "I understand. It's unfair, and you deserve better." The way they handled it wasn't right at all. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the woman offering her company while Jasmine tried to compose herself. She was grateful for the stranger's kindness, but the anger inside her didn't go away. It was hard to shake the feeling of being dismissed and ignored. "I'm sure it's not easy to deal with, especially after everything you've been through," the woman continued gently. "But don't let them get to you. You're stronger than that." Jasmine nodded, though her mind was still clouded with frustration. She appreciated the woman's words, but it didn't change the fact that she was being treated unfairly. As the boarding process began, Jasmine stood up, feeling more determined than ever. She couldn't let this go. She had been wronged, and she wasn't going to just sit there and accept it. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. The flight attendants began calling passengers by seat class, and Jasmine joined the line, holding her new boarding pass tightly in her hand. The woman who had spoken to her smiled and waved as she walked past. Jasmine nodded, giving a small smile in return, but her mind was focused. She wasn't going to let this go without a fight. As she stepped onto the plane and walked down the narrow aisle toward her economy seat, she could feel her heart racing. The seat felt more like a symbol of everything wrong with the situation. But Jasmine wasn't one to back down easily. She would make her voice heard, and she would do whatever it took to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape what happened next. And she wasn't about to let this injustice stand. Jasmine settled into her seat in the economy class, feeling the weight of her frustration pressing down on her. The seat, cramped and uncomfortable, seemed like a far cry from the first-class comfort she had earned. She sighed deeply, glancing out of the window, watching the planes on the tarmac. This wasn't how she had imagined her flight. She had hoped for peace and relaxation, but instead, she was left to stew in her disappointment. As the other passengers began to board, Jasmine kept to herself, her thoughts still heavy with frustration. She had been denied the seat she had rightfully earned, and nothing about the situation felt fair. It wasn't just about the seat, it was the principle of it all. She felt invisible, like her service and sacrifice didn't matter to the people around her. A few minutes later, a woman in her mid-40s sat down next to her. She smiled politely, offering Jasmine a brief, friendly greeting. The woman had soft, warm eyes, and her smile was genuine, like someone who had seen the world and understood how things worked. Jasmine gave a small nod in return, but didn't say much. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. But the woman didn't seem to mind. "Long flight?" she asked, her voice soft, yet curious. Jasmine turned toward her, surprised by the woman's easygoing manner. "Yeah," she replied, still not fully ready to talk. "Just been a rough start. They messed up my seat, and now I'm stuck here." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh no, that's awful. You were supposed to have a first-class seat, right?" Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, It was confirmed when I booked the flight, but they said it was reassigned to someone else. The woman shook her head, her expression sympathetic. I'm so sorry. That doesn't sound right at all. You definitely deserve better than that. Jasmine smiled weakly, grateful for the woman's kindness. She hadn't expected anyone to understand or care, but it felt good to know that someone did. It's just frustrating, she said. I've worked so hard, and for all my service, I was expecting a little bit of respect. It just feels like they don't care. The woman nodded slowly. I completely get it. I think sometimes people forget how much military personnel sacrifice. You all give up so much for the country, and yet, things like this happen. It's not right. Jasmine was surprised by how much the woman seemed to understand. She hadn't expected to find anyone on this flight who could relate to her frustrations. It's just a seat, Jasmine added, feeling a bit embarrassed by how much it had bothered her. But it's more than that. It's about feeling like I matter. The woman smiled warmly. You do matter. And I can tell that you're a strong person, someone who knows their worth. That's what matters the most. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the gentle hum of the plane filling the space between them. Jasmine felt a small sense of peace return, but the anger was still simmering beneath the surface. She was grateful for the stranger's understanding, but she knew she couldn't let the airline's treatment of her go unnoticed. So, what do you do? The woman asked, breaking the silence. Jasmine glanced at her, a little surprised by the question. I'm a soldier, she said, her voice steady but filled with pride. Been serving for years now. This trip is supposed to be my time to rest. But yeah, things didn't go as planned. The woman's eyes widened in admiration. A soldier? Wow. That's incredible. Thank you for your service, she smiled. I think that's even more reason why you deserve better than this. Jasmine smiled back, feeling a sense of gratitude toward the woman for her kind words. The conversation had done more to lift her spirits than she expected. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Even if she had to do it by herself, she wasn't going to let this incident slide. But for now, at least she had someone who understood. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Jasmine could feel the energy in the air shift. This flight wasn't just about getting to her destination. It had become a turning point. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. As the plane took off and soared into the sky, Jasmine leaned back in her seat, still feeling the weight of her frustration. The flight attendants went about their duties, offering drinks and snacks, but Jasmine barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying the events at the counter over and over. Why had this happened? She had done everything right. She had booked her seat in advance, and yet here she was, stuck in a seat that wasn't even close to the comfort she'd expected. But as she thought about it more, a sense of determination began to grow inside her. She wasn't one to sit quietly when something wasn't right. Throughout her years of service, she had learned to stand up for what she believed in, no matter how difficult it might be. She had faced challenges and obstacles before, and she had always found a way to push through. This time would be no different. Jasmine looked out the window, watching as the clouds passed by beneath her. The peaceful view was at odds with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had been trying so hard to maintain her composure, but now she could feel something inside her shifting. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about fairness. It was about respect. She wasn't just going to let this go. I'm not going to let them get away with this, Jasmine whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. It wasn't just about the seat she had been denied. It was about the bigger picture, about how people like her were often overlooked and dismissed, despite their sacrifices and contributions. She was a soldier, a person who had given so much for her country, and yet she was treated like she didn't matter. It wasn't fair. The more she thought about it, the more she knew she had to do something. She couldn't just let this pass. Jasmine had faced enough injustice in her life to know that staying quiet wasn't going to change anything. If she didn't speak up now, nothing would change. With a deep breath, Jasmine pulled out her phone from her bag. She had seen how powerful social media could be. It had given people a platform to share their stories, to make their voices heard. This was her moment. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen to her and others. She was going to use her voice. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she typed. She described the situation at the airport, explaining how she had been denied her first-class seat despite making the reservation well in advance. She shared her feelings of frustration and disappointment, but she also added something more. She wanted to raise awareness. This wasn't just about her. This was about making sure no one else had to go through what she had. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before hitting post. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that this was the right thing to do. It wasn't just a rant. It was a call for action. She wasn't asking for pity. She was asking for change. After hitting post, she leaned back in her seat and took a deep breath. There was no going back now. Her story was out there. She had spoken up. Now all she could do was wait and see what happened next. As the plane continued its journey, Jasmine felt a small sense of relief. She had taken control of the situation, and for the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this. She knew that people would listen. They had to. And when they did, she would be ready to stand tall and fight for what was right. The plane hummed steadily as it cruised through the sky. But for Jasmine, the noise around her faded into the background. She was watching her phone screen, the soft glow lighting up her face. Her social media post had gone live just moments ago, and already her inbox was filling up with notifications. She sat up straighter, her heart beating faster as she saw the number of likes, shares, and comments begin to rise. Jasmine had been nervous about sharing her story, unsure of how people would react. Would they understand? Would they support her? Or would they dismiss her concerns? But as she scrolled through the responses, her worries began to melt away. The comments flooded in quickly, and they were filled with empathy and outrage. People were sharing their own stories of similar experiences, telling her how they too had been treated unfairly, overlooked, or dismissed. One comment read, "I can't believe this happened to you. Thank you for speaking up. This happens to so many of us." Another person wrote, "As a fellow military member, I know what you're going through. You deserve better." Jasmine couldn't help but smile. This was why she had posted her story, so others could see that they weren't alone. It wasn't long before the airline itself took notice. A notification popped up on her screen from the company's official account. They had responded to her post with a simple message. "We apologize for the inconvenience, and we are currently looking into this issue. Please DM us your details so we can resolve this." Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't sure what kind of resolution the airline would offer, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had seen her voice, they had heard her, and now they were acknowledging the mistake. That in itself was a small victory. But Jasmine wasn't satisfied yet. She had made it clear in her post that this wasn't just about her situation. It was about the treatment of military personnel, especially black women, in spaces where they should be respected. She had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced similar discrimination, and she wasn't going to back down now. She typed a response to the airline's message, politely but firmly outlining what had happened. She explained how she had been denied the seat she had reserved, and how the staff at the airport had not offered any real solutions. Jasmine asked for a more meaningful resolution, something that would show the company was serious about changing its practices, not just offering empty apologies. Meanwhile, her post continued to gather attention. The more it spread, the more people shared their stories. A local news outlet reached out, asking if they could feature her experience in a segment about discrimination in the airline industry. They were interested in how one person's frustration could spark a larger conversation. Jasmine agreed, knowing this was an opportunity to keep pushing for change. As the flight continued, Jasmine felt a sense of pride. Her voice was being heard, and her story was making waves. People were paying attention. The anger and frustration that had built up inside her for so long were starting to feel like distant memories. Jasmine realized that by sharing her experience, she had taken control. She wasn't a passive observer of her own life. She was an active participant, shaping the story and the outcome. By the time the plane began its descent, Jasmine felt a shift in herself. The tension she had carried for hours had started to ease. It wasn't just about the seat or the airline. It was about standing up for what was right and using her platform to demand change. Jasmine wasn't done yet, but she knew that she had made a powerful first step toward making sure this wouldn't happen again. The flight finally touched down, and Jasmine felt both relieved and exhausted. She had spent the entire journey grappling with emotions, frustration, anger, determination. But now, as the plane landed, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had done something. She had stood up for herself and for others, and it had sparked something much bigger than she had expected. As she gathered her things and prepared to exit the plane, she checked her phone one last time. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw that the airline had responded again. This time, there was a direct message in her inbox from the official account. It read, "We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and the mistake with your seat. We understand how this has caused frustration, and we are investigating the situation. We would like to offer you a voucher for a future flight, along with our deepest apologies." Jasmine stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. It was a polite response, certainly, but it felt empty. A voucher? Was that really all they could offer after everything that had happened? A small part of her wanted to accept it and move on, but the other part of her, the one that had been fighting for justice, knew that this wasn't enough. A voucher wouldn't make up for the way she had been treated, nor would it solve the larger issue of how military personnel, particularly black women, were often treated in situations like this. Her frustration flared up again, but she knew she had to be strategic. Jasmine wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. She sat down in the airport seating area and typed out her reply. She took a deep breath before she wrote, "Thank you for your response. However, I must respectfully decline the voucher offer. The issue at hand is not about compensation. It is about how military personnel, especially those like myself, who serve our country, are treated in spaces where respect should be guaranteed. I would like to see more meaningful action taken." She paused for a moment after sending the message, then leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the busy terminal. There were hundreds of people around her, each going about their own business, but to Jasmine, it felt like she was standing alone in a world that often overlooked people like her. She took comfort in knowing, though, that she wasn't truly alone. Her story had gained traction. People were listening. The social media post she had shared earlier had become viral, spreading far beyond what she could have imagined. People were sharing her post in support, tagging the airline, and demanding better treatment for military personnel. Her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, comments, shares, and messages of solidarity. It felt like a wave of support had rolled in from every direction. Within a few hours, the airline reached out again. This time, the tone was different. They offered a more thoughtful and sincere apology, acknowledging the broader issues Jasmine had raised. "We fully understand your concerns, and we regret that we have not met your expectations. We are reviewing our practices and will be implementing new procedures to ensure that military personnel receive the respect they deserve. We would like to discuss this matter further and find a way to make things right." Jasmine smiled as she read the message. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a sign that her voice had been heard, and it had made a difference. The anger she had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had faced similar treatment. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was a step in the right direction. As she boarded her connecting flight home, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had made an impact. She had turned a frustrating, unjust situation into an opportunity for change. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions, like speaking up, could lead to big results. And Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning. Jasmine couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. What had started as a frustrating situation at an airport had now become something much bigger. She had expected a few people to notice her social media post, maybe even a few messages of support, but she never imagined it would catch the attention of the media. It all started when a local news outlet reached out to her. They had seen her post, and they wanted to know more. They asked for an interview, hoping to shed light on the treatment of military personnel, especially black women, in public spaces. At first, Jasmine was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she was ready to speak publicly about her experience. It had been a tough few days, and the last thing she wanted was to relive the frustration. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was bigger than her. This was about raising awareness and making sure that something like this didn't happen to others. She wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by. She agreed to the interview, knowing it would help her message reach a wider audience. The reporter met her at a cafe just outside the airport. Jasmine was nervous, but the reporter was kind and understanding. She asked questions about Jasmine's experience, allowing her to speak openly about the challenges she had faced. Jasmine talked about how the situation at the airport had made her feel invisible and unimportant, despite her years of service. She explained how the airline had offered her a voucher as compensation, but that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted respect, recognition, and change. As Jasmine spoke, she could feel a sense of purpose growing inside her. This wasn't just about the seat she had been denied. It was about something much larger. She was fighting for the dignity and rights of all military personnel, especially those who, like her, had been overlooked and disrespected. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a soldier, and she deserved to be treated with honor. The interview went well, and a reporter promised to feature her story on the evening news. Jasmine left the cafe feeling a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and hope. She had done something important, something that could lead to real change. Later that evening, Jasmine sat down in front of her TV to watch the news. Her heart raced as the segment began. The reporter introduced the story, and there she was, Jasmine, sitting in the cafe, speaking about her experience. The camera zoomed in as Jasmine explained how the airline had mishandled the situation and how she had used social media to bring attention to the issue. The story aired on multiple news channels, and soon it was trending online. People from all over the country began to share her story, many of them expressing their support and frustration with the way military personnel were treated. It wasn't just Jasmine's voice anymore. It was the voice of thousands of others who had been silently enduring similar treatment. The airline, realizing the scale of the situation, issued another public apology. This time, it wasn't just a simple offer of compensation. They announced that they would be implementing new policies to better accommodate military personnel and ensure that they were treated with the respect they deserved. Jasmine was glad to see the company taking responsibility, but she knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was a step in the right direction, but there was still more work to be done. As Jasmine watched the responses pour in on social media, she felt a sense of fulfillment. Her voice had made a difference. She had turned a frustrating experience into something positive, something that could help others in the future. Jasmine knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had been treated unfairly and hadn't had the chance to speak up. And with that, Jasmine realized she had become a part of something much larger than herself. This was the power of standing up, speaking out, and making sure that your voice was heard. It was the beginning of a change, and Jasmine was proud to be at the heart of it. Jasmine's phone continued to buzz with messages and notifications. Every time she checked, it seemed like there were more people sharing her story, more people commenting, more people standing in solidarity. The media attention had blown the situation wide open. What had started as a small social media post had turned into a national conversation about how military personnel, especially those in marginalized communities, were treated in public spaces. The airline, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation, continued to make changes. They issued a second public apology, one that was far more thoughtful than the first. They not only promised to improve their policies, but also reached out directly to Jasmine, asking for a private conversation to discuss how they could make amends and ensure this didn't happen again. Jasmine felt a sense of pride wash over her as she read the airline's new statement. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The company had acknowledged the problem, and they were taking steps to address it. She knew that this was more than just about the seat she had been denied. It was about sending a message that those who served their country deserved to be treated with respect. But it didn't stop there. As the days went on, Jasmine began receiving messages from other military members, men and women, from all branches of service, who had faced similar issues. They shared their own stories of being overlooked or disrespected, not just by airlines, but by other businesses, institutions, and even individuals. Jasmine began to realize that her experience was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger pattern, a deep-rooted issue that needed to be addressed. In one particularly emotional message, a fellow soldier shared how he had been treated unfairly by a hotel staff when trying to check in after a long deployment. "I was in my uniform, tired, and just trying to get some rest," the message read. "They wouldn't even let me check in until I showed them my ID. I felt like I wasn't even human to them." Jasmine was moved by this message, and she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about giving a voice to all the soldiers who had faced similar mistreatment but hadn't had the opportunity to speak up. Soon, a coalition of military personnel and activists began to form, with Jasmine at the center of it. They started working on a campaign aimed at raising awareness of how military members were treated in public spaces. The goal was to ensure that companies and businesses had clear policies that treated military personnel with the respect and dignity they deserved. Jasmine had never imagined that her frustration over a seat would lead to such a movement. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was what she had always fought for, not just for herself, but for everyone who had served their country and been treated as if they didn't matter. As Jasmine reflected on everything that had happened, she felt a sense of fulfillment. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of anger and frustration, times when she questioned whether it was worth the fight. But now, as she looked back, she knew it had been worth it. She had turned a personal injustice into a larger cause, and in doing so, she had helped bring about real change. The airline's commitment to improving its policies was just the beginning. Other companies followed suit, revisiting their own practices when it came to military personnel. Jasmine had become a symbol of strength, determination, and the power of speaking out. She had shown that one voice could make a difference. And as she looked ahead, Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. The fight for respect and fairness was ongoing, but she was ready to face whatever came next. As the weeks went by, Jasmine began to realize just how much her actions had impacted the world around her. The support she had received from fellow military members, the public, and even people who had never met her was overwhelming. It was clear that her story had touched a nerve. The way she had stood up for herself, even when faced with a seemingly small injustice, had sparked a much larger conversation about respect, fairness, and dignity. Her phone continued to buzz with messages. Some were from people she didn't know, thanking her for speaking out. Others were from military personnel who had experienced similar mistreatment and who were now inspired to stand up for themselves. Many people shared stories about how Jasmine's bravery had given them the courage to speak out as well. She was humbled by all the support, but also deeply moved by the stories others had shared. As Jasmine walked into her apartment one evening after a long day, she found herself pausing in the doorway. A small box sat on the table, a letter tucked on top of it. It was from the airline. She had nearly forgotten about it after all the attention her story had received. Curious, she opened the letter and found a personal note inside, handwritten by one of the company's senior executives. The letter expressed deep regret for the way she had been treated and outlined the steps the airline was taking to improve their policies for military personnel. They had already begun training their staff to better understand and respect the service members who flew with them. Additionally, the airline had promised to set up a special support system for military travelers, ensuring they would always receive the service and care they deserved. The letter was followed by an invitation for Jasmine to visit their headquarters for a meeting. The company wanted her to help guide them as they moved forward with these changes. She was invited to speak at their next employee training event, to share her story and the lessons learned. Jasmine read the letter twice, feeling a mix of emotions. She had hoped for change, but seeing it in writing was something else entirely. Her voice had been heard, and it had created real, lasting change. It was the kind of outcome she had hoped for when she first spoke out, but she had never imagined it would go this far. Her story had done more than make a difference for herself. It had created a ripple effect. The conversations that started with a simple post on social media had grown into something much bigger. Businesses had begun to reevaluate how they treated military personnel, and others were speaking up about their own experiences. Jasmine had started a movement, and she couldn't be prouder of the results. But even with all the attention, she remained grounded. She knew that this was just one victory, not the end of the journey. The fight for fairness and respect was ongoing, and there were still battles to be won. Jasmine felt that she had only just begun to scratch the surface of what was possible when people came together and raised their voices. As she looked out her window that evening, she reflected on everything she had accomplished. She had faced frustration, but she had turned it into something powerful. She had faced injustice, but instead of staying quiet, she had stood up for herself and for others. In doing so, she had helped make the world a little bit better. Jasmine smiled to herself. This was more than just a victory. It was a reminder that no matter how small an issue may seem, standing up for what's right could lead to meaningful change. And for the first time in a long while, Jasmine knew she had made a real difference.